Hey there, folks. How's it going? And welcome to the lecture that we were supposed to have the week before, but there was the contract negotiations going on, and it looked like there was going to be a strike. And there was a big rally on the Friday that because of my involvement with the union, I was busy doing that. So apologies for missing that lecture, but this is the lecture for last week. This week we're going to be back on track, so I'll be delivering a lecture this Friday. So what we're going to talk about today is a follow-up from obviously the lecture that we did before. And the lecture before, I'll share my screen here and we can get going. The lecture before we talked about the evidence that exists for human beings having a fundamentally social and cooperative nature. And of course, the lecture before that, we looked at the evidence that supports the idea that instead we're essentially violent and aggressive and antisocial. And of course, we're looking at the question of human nature to try and find out, is the crisis that our civilization is facing today, is it simply related to how we are hardwired? Are we just genetically predisposed to, destroy things and murder each other and all that sort of stuff? And so, in looking at human nature the past two classes, I think we've realized that actually you can't really support that argument that all the problems we face are simply because human beings are essentially aggressive and violent and selfish. That just doesn't hold up. And so, if anything, the more scientific view focuses on the fact that we are incredibly intelligent, we're social, we're cooperative, that these are the characteristics that most define us as human beings. So what we're going to look at in this class is we're going to look at human evolution, and we're going to look at how we develop these characteristics. And it's important just to sort of understand how we are the way we are, but also, as we're going to see, the earliest human communities, the earliest communities that we evolved in, still have an awful lot that they can teach us about how to live in harmony with other human beings and with the natural world. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this lecture. We're going to start out by revisiting a term that you may remember from previous lectures. And this is this idea of the state of nature. And the state of nature was sort of a thought exercise that philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if you remember, they're known as sometimes the social contract theorists. So these were, philosophers writing in Europe between the 1600s and late 1700s, early 1800s. And they thought about what human beings would have been like before advanced state level societies, right? So they call this the state of nature. So if we look at what modern science tells us about the state of nature, we find out some interesting things. First of all, we find out that it's kind of a flawed question to ask, because there was never a time when human beings existed with no society, right? Part of who we are as literally as animals is we've always lived in cooperative groups. So we've always lived in society. So there's no such thing as like a time before society. And we've always had culture too, right? In terms of modern human beings, because culture actually started before modern human beings. So we inherited that from our earlier ancestors. However, having said that, there is some utility in looking at how we lived for the first, 250,000 years of our existence, right? So for over 95% of our history, we lived in very particular kinds of societies. So what we're going to look at in this lecture is what were those early societies like? And then how did they change from those early societies into what we know today, the kind of highly hierarchical, stratified, complex societies? We're going to look at the question of how the transition happened a little bit more in next lecture. This lecture, we're more going to look at what early societies can teach us. So, what about early human evolution Can we learn? Like, can we take from in terms of confronting the challenges that our civilization faces today? Because we have to remember, folks, I mean, we evolved during a very, very difficult time. It was a time when our other hominid cousins didn't survive, right? So it wasn't an easy thing for humanity to survive to the point it is today. Part of how we did this is because of the kinds of societies we lived in. So if they helped us survive 300,000 years ago, maybe they can teach us some lessons in the present day. So let's look at those early humans then. What were they like and how did we live? Well, modern human beings, as I've mentioned, I know in previous lectures, emerged around 300,000 years ago in Africa. And this is Homo sapiens sapiens, right? That's us. And we came on the scene and we were living right from the get-go as what is known as immediate return foragers. Immediate return means these are people that are living directly off the land. So you're immediately getting resources. That's what immediate return means, as opposed to people, for instance, who are raising livestock or planting crops, right? That's not immediate return subsistence. Immediate return foragers, you know, we're hunting, we're gathering. That's pretty much what we're doing. When we're living in these societies, for most of the year, we'd be living in very small bands of just between 20 and 50 members. So a couple of families, you could think, right, would get together and they would form a band and they would live this way for most of the year. However, at least a couple of times a year, these smaller bands would also get together in much larger gatherings. And these larger gatherings were really important. This is where we would exchange information, we would trade with each other, we would also exchange partners, right? So this is how you'd find someone to marry, you know, obviously it wouldn't be within your own little 20 to 50 person band. You usually want to find a partner from other groups. So this is how we first evolved as modern human beings. And the entire human population was extremely small. Okay, so this is what we have to understand as well. So from 300,000 years ago, when we first evolved, up until about 10,000 years ago, so 290,000 years, over that entire span, there were very, very few human beings. Okay, you know, you're looking at, you know, maybe, I don't know, like under 50,000 probably on the entire planet. Oh, you know, and if you contrast that today with what, you know, over 7 billion people. So this is something we have to understand as well. We evolved in a situation where there was not a lot of competition for land, competition for space, none of that, right? There was a ton of space for us to sort of wander through. And then the first thing that started happening that changed this way of life is we started to stay put. And this is what researchers call being sedentary. So early hunter-gatherers, early immediate return foragers were not sedentary. We moved around a lot. We followed game animals and we also followed food sources, right? So we were nomadic peoples in the beginning. However, over time, and again, this took a long time, we started settling down in permanent villages. So about 20,000 years ago, in parts of Europe and Asia, a culture known as the Gravescian culture started to be able to create permanent hunting villages. And these villages were based on the availability of a large amount of big game animals, right? Like bison and mammoths and these sorts of things. And we would hunt them. And there were so many of these huge herds of these animals, we were able to just basically stay put, and hunting parties would go out on a regular basis and kill these animals, and we were able to just sort of stay put, right? Later on, sedentary villages also developed around agriculture. And so about 12,000 years before present, in the Natufian culture, so this is around modern day Turkey and Iraq, these people started to cultivate or actually, first of all, they just gathered a lot of wild grains, and then eventually they started to cultivate those wild grains themselves. And there was enough food that they also stayed put, and they had permanent villages. The other early instance of this occurred on the coast, and this is where you had early fishing villages in modern day Japan. The Jomo culture, about 12,000 years ago, created permanent settlements on the ocean where there was plentiful fish, and they were able to just stay put year after year. So the change from being nomadic to sedentary was a big change, and it led to a whole bunch of different modifications that we'll talk about in a few slides. So some other big questions that we want to ask about the earliest human communities. If you remember from the lecture where I talked about the evidence for us being selfish and aggressive, for a number of years, some researchers thought that we were extremely warlike right from the beginning, right? Well, what's the evidence for that? If you look at the actual evidence, there is no archaeological evidence that the earliest human beings waged war. So that's, organized violence between two different groups of people. There's zero evidence of that. There's also no evidence that we had high rates of violence within the group. So it wasn't just like we were murdering each other, right, on a regular basis at all. There's also no archaeological evidence that we wiped out the earlier versions of human beings that we shared the planet with, right? So, some researchers for a while thought, oh, the reason why the Neanderthals died out, for instance, is because modern humans came in, and because we were these like psychotic killers, we just killed them all off, right? That's totally not the case. There's no evidence for that. If anything, there is evidence that our species, modern human beings, interbred with our ancestors, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And so if anything, we weren't hostile. We were actually, we would cohabitate, we would swap partners and whatnot. And so your average European today has between 1% and 4% of their DNA is directly traced back to Neanderthals. And there was even recently an interesting archaeological find, a skeleton that was dated to 40,000 years before present. So that's not that long ago. And the skeleton was found in Romania, and it had 11% Neanderthal DNA. That's an incredibly high percentage of Neanderthal DNA. And that meant that it had a direct Neanderthal ancestor about 4 to 6 generations earlier. That's not very long. So just, a couple hundred years beforehand, that skeleton, that individual had a direct Neanderthal ancestor. So clearly it was not the case that we just wiped out the other human beings. Yes, we ended up out-competing them, but there's other reasons for that we're going to get into as we continue on in the lecture. So one of the tricks, though, is it's hard for us to actually go back in time. So the archaeological record, we can solve certain arguments. So for instance, about early warfare, but we don't really know in a detailed way how we lived 250,000 years ago, right? We can't actually go back in time and see how we lived. However, what we can do is we can look at modern hunter-gatherer groups. So these are groups that are still living directly off the land, and they can help us understand our earliest human communities. Excuse me. So it's important to say, we're not saying they're exactly like we lived 200,000 years ago. Okay, that would be a false thing to say, because today's hunter-gatherer groups are also evolving, right? And they have evolved over, the past thousands of years. However, they are similar, right? So we can draw sort of tentative conclusions from these early from these contemporary hunter-gatherer people. And so what we want to do is want to look at, well, what are some common characteristics that we see in contemporary human societies that live directly from the land. They still live in the small communities, gathering and hunting their food. What are some characteristics they possess? Well, the first thing you notice when you look at these small scale societies is that they are highly, highly cooperative. And cooperation is arguably our most important evolutionary adaptation as human beings, apart from our creative intelligence, apart from the fact that we're incredibly smart. We get these huge brains with complex consciousness and all of that. We're going to talk a little bit more about how we evolved those huge brains. But along with our intelligence, cooperation was incredibly important. And the reason for this should be pretty obvious, right? If you're working together with other people, it enables you to collectively share resources and also to create things that you can't create on your own. Things like language, culture, technology. You got to think, I mean, if you're just an isolated human being and you never work with other people, how could you even create a language? It wouldn't make sense. Language evolves to communicate information to other people, right? So our cooperation was absolutely fundamental to who we became as human beings. And cooperation is interesting because it enables us to increase our power to do things, right? So if you think about it, one individual has a certain amount of power, muscle power, brain power, you name it, right? We can get a certain amount of stuff done. However, if you get a bunch of people to work together, you create a condition that we could call power with, and that is where a bunch of people combine their power to accomplish incredible things. Such as, for instance, in this picture here, you have a group of Amish who are collectively raising a barn together. And it's an incredible example of cooperation where all the members in an Amish community will come together and they'll all work on one family's barn and they'll all build this massive barn in a single day, right? It's incredible. Whereas that one family they couldn't even build it. It would be impossible for that one family. They just wouldn't be able to. Or even if they managed to somehow do it, it might take them like 6 months or something like that to build this huge barn. However, power with people coming together, bam, they raise that barn in a day. That's incredible. That's powerful. And that's different from power over. And we're going to talk more about that in the next couple of lectures. Power over is when you try to, or you're able to force other people to do things for you, right? Especially to force other people to do things that they'd rather not do. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking, first of all, cooperation is power with. We all come together to work together because it's in all of our best interests. And this is how early human communities, how they operate. And cooperation requires a bunch of different things. First of all, it requires reciprocation. It means, I help you, you help me, we help each other back and forth, right? It requires honesty, okay? Why? Because you got to build relationships of trust with other people, right? So that's a healthy balance of individual and collective interest. Why do I cooperate with you? Well, so you'll cooperate back with me, right? So it's not like cooperation is just all self-sacrifice. We benefit from it as well. And that's why one of the reasons why it's such a powerful form of adaptation. We all become more successful, more likely to survive and thrive. And so what anthropologists have discovered is that cooperative cultures form, and this is a term that I have used in the book. They form what I call a life system. And the reason why I call it a life system is because it was a system, a social organization that enabled us to survive when all of our other hominid brothers and sisters perished. Okay, we were the only human species to survive, even though when we evolved, we shared the planet with many other hominid species, right? At least 4 others that we're aware of. They all vanished. Only we survived. One of the reasons for this is because we were incredibly cooperative. And the life system, this system that I talk about in the book, emerges from what I call the primordial adaptive complex. And these are three important characteristics that human beings possess, which made us so successful, right? So I'm going to talk now about that primordial adaptive complex. What are these three important characteristics that human beings evolved that made us so successful and that enabled us to form these cooperative, sustainable societies? So the life system is based on, like I said, the primordial adaptive complex. Primordial just means it's very old. Adaptive means it helped us to adapt and survive. And complex means it's three different things that all connect together. So what are these three things? Well, one, I mentioned it before, our creative intelligence, the fact that we are very smart as human beings. And our intelligence is also allows us to be very creative. We can innovate, we can develop new tools, new ways of doing things, all that stuff. The other thing that's very important, another important characteristic is we're incredibly social and cooperative. So we live together in groups. Because of this, we're communicating with each other all the time. We help each other out through power with, makes us more successful. A third thing, which is a really important piece of this puzzle, is empathy. And empathy really is kind of shorthand for a whole host of what we could call social instincts that human beings have. And basically, this means that human beings are really good at, first of all, expressing emotions, understanding the emotions of other people, feeling the emotions of other people. And all of this sort of emotional sophistication, emotional intelligence makes us better communicators, better cooperators, better able to work together for our mutual benefit and mutual survival. So all of these things kind of connect together to create basically who we are and to explain why we were so incredibly successful from an evolutionary perspective. So let's look at the first piece of this, the creative intelligence. Just how did human beings get so intelligent? What was the evolutionary mechanism for this? Well, first of all, over time, our ancestors had pretty big brains, but the brain size increased substantially from the very first human beings to us today. About 3 times our brains increased in size. That's pretty impressive, right? Also, if we look at us in relation to other primates, because human beings are primates, we're like hairless monkeys, folks. That's just who we are. And our relative hairlessness distinguishes us from the other primates, but also the fact that we've got these huge brains, right? So we'll have the largest brains out of all the primates. We also have the second most neurons in our brains than any other animal on the planet. The only animal that has more neurons in their brain are African elephants. And this is one of the fascinating things about African elephants. They are extremely intelligent animals. They have very large, very complex brains, right? And a lot of people don't realize that about elephants. I mean, obviously we know dolphins too are up there as well. But except for elephants, human beings have the most complex, neuronally dense brains on the planet. So folks, we're pretty smart, right? And what's interesting too is the largest increase in brain development happened relatively recently in the evolution of hominids, of human type beings, between 800,000 years before present and 200,000 years before present. And so, recently there was this real spike in brain evolution. And there's a number of theories as to why we develop these big brains. The two biggest ones, though, are one, in relation to environmental changes, and two, in relation to increased socialization and cooperation, right? So these are sort of the two evolutionary forces, if you think of it that way, that led to our brains getting larger and larger. And obviously with larger brains, folks, we're talking about more intellectual capacity, more cognitive capacity, more intelligence, right? So the greater socialization is simply, as we relied more and more on cooperation, you got to think about this. That would create a selective pressure that the people who are best able to communicate and form relationships would be more likely to survive, right? And so that's why human beings over time, generation after generation after generation, the people who were best at working in groups would survive more. They'd have more kids, right? So eventually those genes get passed on and we become more and more social. So it kind of creates like a positive feedback system. The more social we get, the more we evolve social instincts. The more we have social instincts, the more social we get. It just keeps spiraling, right? And driving larger brains. The other interesting thing is also climate, okay? And so as we encountered challenges in our environment, the more challenging the environment, the more we see brain growth get spurred. And so this is an interesting diagram. So it's looking at, let's say from about 4 million years ago to 3 million to 2 million to 1 million to today. And then it has this axis here is brain case volume. Brain case is like literally your skull and the volume that exists for your brain to grow into, right? And so here we see, about 3.5 million years ago, the average brain size for one of our ancestors was only about 500 cc's, right? So very, very small. And it slowly increases, and then about 1 million years later, it starts getting a little bit higher, up around 700-800 cc's. But it's basically from about 1 million years ago till today, sort of like I said in the previous slide, 800 and 200,000 years ago, that brain size really starts to increase. And what's interesting is the top portion of the graph here is how variable the climate was. And so the greatest increase in brain size is also associated with the greatest increase in climatic fluctuation. So this means like temperatures rising and falling, that sort of stuff, right? And, extremely variable climate has a big impact on food availability, on, surviving harsh weather, all of these sorts of things. And the basic idea here, folks, is that as the environment gets more intense, more difficult to survive, you've got to think more, you've got to problem solve, you've got to cooperate more, you've got to develop new tools, new clothing, new shelters, right, in order to survive. All of these things spur the development of intelligence, right? So at the end of the day, those two things, cooperation and sociality, and changing environments, these things led to this incredible intelligence that we now have today. So creative intelligence, big, important characteristic that we have. But another one is, like I said before, these incredible social instincts that we possess. We cooperate, we're social, and we're very, very good at it. Our ability to understand and experience the emotions of others is a very special thing that human beings have. And so I'll start by giving sort of an example of how this looks like in small scale hunter-gatherer societies. And the example here comes from the Khoisan Bushmen. So they're sometimes called pygmies, and these are hunter-gatherers that live in the Sahara in Africa. And the Khoisan do this ritual on a regular basis, which they call a giraffe dance. And this is a picture of a giraffe dance happening right here, where the whole group gets together, they have a big fire, they have a big feast, and then they play music and they dance and they sing, and they all do it collectively as a group. And the sacred dances have a very specific purpose. It's to bring the group together and to create sort of a harmonious state in which if there's any tensions or weirdness in the group, it gets just blown away, it gets released, it gets forgotten. People make up if they're fighting. If people aren't feeling well, they feel better after. If people are scared or anxious, they have that sort of dissolved by the whole group coming together and expressing their solidarity. So this is an example, this idea that the group comes together and everyone shares this sense of well-being and collective belonging. There's a term called interbeing, and it was coined by actually a Vietnamese Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a very interesting figure historically. He was an activist working alongside Martin Luther King in the 1960s in the American Civil Rights Movement. Very, very wise man. And he talks about interbeing as the realization that you as an individual are fundamentally connected to the other beings around you, your family, your friends, your community, right? But also even beyond other human beings, we're connected to the non-human world. I mean, in ways that should be really obvious to us, with the air we breathe, right? If we're not constantly breathing in air, then we die. The water we drink, if we're not constantly drinking, we die. The food we eat, right? All of these aspects of the natural world are part of us, and we are a part of it. And so this is what interbeing refers to. And what's interesting about human beings, though, is we can understand this on an intellectual level, but we can actually experience the being of others as parts of ourself. So this is where we kind of are able to extend our empathy. Empathy is feeling the feelings of others, right? Empathy lies beneath love. It lies beneath friendship. It lies beneath all of these things that we take for granted as human beings. Through interbeing, we can extend empathy so that we feel that our family are part of ourselves, our friends are a part of ourselves, our community members, you know, the whole 9 yards. What's really interesting, though, folks, about traditional societies like the Khmer that I have in the picture here, is traditional societies are really sophisticated in their understanding of interbeing. So they're able to extend empathy. They're able to extend the sense of self to include all of the natural world that they exist within. And this is what researcher Jeremy Rifkin calls biosphere consciousness. So biosphere, folks, the biosphere is the entire web of life on planet Earth. When we use that name biosphere, that's what we're referring to. So these hunter-gatherer groups, these traditional societies, are able to extend their sense of connection and caring and emotional response to encompass the entire natural world. So, you know, really the idea is that they start with themselves, and obviously, you know, human beings as a rule, we care about ourselves, we care about our own happiness and our own success and our own survival, right? But we also extend our sense of self to include the people that we love, right? I mean, excuse me, there's a reason why if you lose someone that you love, you know, if a family member passes away, a partner, a close friend, we say we've lost a part of ourselves, right? This is a very, very common human saying and understanding. In a lot of ways, it's really true. That person really was a part of yourself, right? Why? Because you've extended your empathy to include that person in a sense of who you are. But you can also extend your empathy further. You can extend it to include the community you exist within, and that causes you to care about your community. Maybe it's the neighborhood you live in. Maybe it's your city. right? And you want good things for the people in your city or for the people in your neighborhood. And you can extend empathy even further. We know people are capable of doing this to encompass all of humanity. And in fact, this is what most of the world's religions talk about, the whole idea that all human beings are brothers and sisters, right? That we're all part of one family, okay? So this is something that we're also capable of too. It's quite incredible. However, we can go even further, and this is what the small scale hunter-gatherer societies that live directly on the land, they're able to extend their empathy to include non-human nature as well, and to view all beings as part of one big family. There's another example of this, which is closer to home, right? Which is a local group of Native peoples known as the Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations Confederacy. Now, if you'll remember, I mentioned them a few lectures ago when I talked about the law of 7 generations. So this is one of the very wise teachings of the Haudenosaunee, that, remember, you're supposed to, if you're going to make decisions, you have to think about 7 generations down the road. Well, one of the other wise teachings of the Haudenosaunee is that we, that means individual human beings, have a moral obligation to what they say are all of our relations. Okay, so this is a term that is used among North American Native groups, in particular among the Haudenosaunee. They talk about all our relations, or all my relations. But what they mean is that, you know, we are a part of a family of all life. So, you know, some people might, like people from a non-native culture, be like, oh, you know, my relations are like my family, you know, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, grandparents, children. Those are your relations, right? Well, the Haudenosaunee say, oh yeah, those are your relations, but so are your friends. So is the whole community you live in. So is every single human being on the planet. So are all the animals and plants. They're all living beings. And even beyond the animals and plants, the non-human, non-sentient nature, the rocks, the waters, right? These things are also part of your family, okay? And what's interesting then is that if all of these things are part of your family, if that's how you literally view and feel about life on Earth, you obviously treat it in a very different way than we see, generally speaking, in modern industrial capitalist society, where regularly in business practices, we exploit other human beings. We even destroy their communities for our own profit. We routinely destroy natural ecosystems for our own convenience and our own profit. And that is completely the opposite from how traditional societies view human and non-human life. So very, very different. So that's a really important point. This whole idea of empathy, interbeing, and biosphere consciousness. What's also interesting too, though, is how these small scale societies, these hunter-gatherer groups, how they actually make decisions and how they structure their communities. And they have a characteristic that it's a very important one. It's called egalitarianism. Egalitarianism means societies in which people are politically equal, okay? And it's an interesting problem that these small groups would have run up against, right? Because there's no government, there's no police forces, there's no, you know, written laws even in most of these societies. So how do you make sure people do the right thing? How do you make decisions? How do you, you know, punish bad behavior? How do you do all these things? You know, how do you create rules that are effective, but to do it without no jails, no police, no nothing like that, right? It's a very, very interesting kind of problem they had to face. Another question too is, how do you, if you got your groovy little group of 30 to 50 people living off the land, how do you prevent one person who's maybe like, some guy who's like super big and aggressive and violent, how do you prevent him from just taking over the group? Being like, I can take any one of you, right? I'm going to rule this group with an iron fist. I'm going to make life miserable for everyone. What do you do, right, about that? And so what's really interesting is the kinds of societies that these groups exist within. Like I said, they're egalitarian, which means all of the adults are roughly equal in terms of their power, right? So it's not like they're ruled by one like alpha male or alpha female or whatnot. It's not it at all. Instead, what you see when you look at these societies is the earliest and purest form of what we later call democracy. So you see the roots of democracy in these small scale societies in terms of how they actually operate. And so egalitarianism, a society in which all the adults have roughly equal power, it's based on values of fairness, values of equality. And these sorts of societies, they protect individual freedom, but they also ensure the collective good. So they're really interesting ways of balancing individual autonomy with the good of the group. Because in these sorts of societies, it's not like you can force people to do a lot. You kind of can't, right? Because again, you got no courts, you got no police force, you got no army, nothing like that. And yet, at the end of the day, through very sophisticated means, people come together and kind of stay on the same page, and they solve problems and all these other incredible things. So an interesting question is, how did this kind of society emerge, right? Well, actually, sorry, the last point there, I forgot to call it up, is that decision-making in these societies tends to be inclusive, transparent, fair, and accountable. So basically, they tend to make pretty good decisions that involve the input of all of the group members. Because again, if you can't force people to do things, you kind of have to get buy-in from everyone as much as possible when you make a decision. So that's kind of how decisions happen in these societies. So how did they emerge? How did they evolve? Well, there's an anthropologist named Christopher Bohm who's done some really interesting research on this question. And he hypothesizes that early humans created what he calls moral communities. And these moral communities are basically a society in which there's rules of interaction that reinforce cooperation. Because his argument is, if cooperation was one of our most powerful adaptive mechanisms, part of what made it so effective was that we created cultures that reinforced cooperation. And we created moral rules that governed cooperation, such as the moral rule that if someone helps you, you have to help them back, right? That's a moral rule, right? And that's what helps structure cooperation and create functioning human communities. In a moral community, we all have a moral obligation to each other, right? It's the idea that everyone has rights. Everyone is fully human. You can't just take someone's stuff. You can't just attack them for no reason, right? Like, you can't just throw them out of the group for no reason. Like, why? Because we have an obligation to them. And this is a very, very important sort of bedrock upon which human societies are built. Part of what helps this is through interbeing. This moral obligation we have with other human beings also then extends to non-human nature, right? In the sense that we actually think that, not only do I have a moral obligation to the other members of my tribe or my community, I also have a moral obligation to the animals that I hunt, right? Which kind of makes sense. The idea is that, well, if I just kill all the animals and, and just waste all the food and whatnot, I'm going to starve, right? Like, my community is going to perish. So we respect the animals that we hunt. We respect the plants that we gather. because they sustain our lives, right? And that feeling of respect makes us treat them in a way that actually ends up helping us and sustaining us, right? So moral communities at the end of the day lead to behavior that supports the survival of the group. And also what's interesting about these groups too is they developed very sophisticated mechanisms to deal with some of the problems that you get anytime you have a group of people coming together, right? So anytime you have a group of people coming together, you may have someone, you may have a person who's like, well, I'm going to cheat, I'm going to, I'm going to steal my buddy's stuff instead of like, or I don't want to go gather food. So I'm just going to steal some from the collective, pile of food or stock or store of food that everyone else gathered. You've got to guard against that. I mean, some people will try and do that, right? And so these small scale groups had ways to reinforce not to do that. Or if someone did it, then there'd be ways to punish them, right? Usually through kind of shaming and ridicule and gossip and stuff like that. They had ways also to deal with tyrants, and tyrants are people that would try and force their will on the group and try and bully people, that sort of thing. Well, you had to be able to deal with that problem as well. And we're going to see in the next slide how they dealt with tyrants. And then also you had to be able to deal with the problem of free riders. And that's this picture I have here is a picture illustrating the problem of free riders. Free riders are people who just want to they want to gain all the benefits, but they don't want to do any work, right? We've all encountered that, folks, and it's incredibly frustrating. In fact, anytime you've done group work, you've probably encountered free riders. So people who are like, oh yeah, I'll let you do all the work and then I'll get the mark too, right? And it's frustrating. You're like, oh, these people, right? They want everything, but they don't want to work for it. They don't want to contribute, right? So again, these groups had to deal with that problem too, these small scale societies, and usually they were pretty damned effective. That if you were perceived by the group to not be pulling your weight, they let you know in no uncertain terms, right? Again, like I said, through using things like shame and ridicule and mockery and gossip, right? I mean, these things can be very effective. You don't have to be violent or anything like that. And you can basically get someone to realize, oh, wait, I'm being a total doofus here. I'm not pulling my weight. And so that's how these societies were able to manage these problems. The problem of tyrants is a big one. And so one of the things that Christopher Bohm said is that probably one of the main reasons why egalitarian societies evolved. So remember, egalitarian societies are societies in which all of the adults have roughly equal levels of power. One of the reasons for that evolving is to protect the group against domination by aggressive alphas. So aggressive alphas almost always men, a very small percentage of men, but there are, throughout history, there have been certain men who are ultra aggressive, violent, domineering, and willing to try and use threat and force to control the people around them, right? This has been an ancient problem that human beings have had to deal with. And how groups dealt with this challenge was through the creation of counterpower coalitions. And counterpower coalitions, the reason why I have, people might be wondering why I have this comic book cover here. This is a cover from the X-Men. This is the old X-Men comic that I used to read when I was a kid. So this proves how old I am. And in this cover of this comic book, you have a very common thing that would happen in comic books, which is that you've got this big villain. And in this case, the big villain is Magneto. And he is super powerful and he is an aggressive alpha. He wants to take over the world and he wants to dominate all the people around him. And the problem is, a lot of times, if you've got this aggressive alpha, any one person isn't going to be able to stand up to them, right? Because usually the aggressive alpha is like they're big, they're strong, and they're violent in a way that most other people aren't. So it's hard for one person to take them on. However, when you've got a team of people, in this case, you've got a team of comic book superheroes. However, in a small scale society, would be all of the other adults, right? So think about it. If you've got a small scale hunter gatherer society, and there is one guy that starts getting abusive and aggressive and violent and starts trying to take control of the group, and say maybe there's 10 men total in the group, the 9 other men would tend to get together and be like, listen, buddy, you could take any one of us alone, but you're not going to fight any one of us alone. If you don't fall into line, you're going to fight all of us, right? And that is how you keep a tyrant in check. That's how you deal with someone who's trying to throw their weight around, right? It's usually how you stand up to a bully, is that people have to get together, and there's strength in numbers, right? And that's what a counterpower coalition is all about, right? Counterpower means that they're countering the power of that one tyrant with a number of different people, right? And research suggests that this is a very, very important mechanism by which they guarded against the danger of aggressive alphas. And also in this process, both men and women play a large role in making sure that these cultures remain egalitarian. Remember, I said a number of times, just on the previous slide, that a lot of times you kept people in line just by sort of making fun of them, right? And just by sort of like mocking them or gossiping about them, right? Because people don't want to know that. People don't want to think that people are talking about their back, behind their backs. And so women can be very effective at this in a lot of these small scale societies, right? And they especially good at kind of keeping men in line. However, if that failed to work, if a man started to just get violent, regardless, and didn't care, that's when you'd get this counterpower coalition of other men who literally, if push came to shove, would exile that person from the group or kill that person, right? I mean, again, there's no jails, there's no courts, there's no police. So if things got really bad, and this would be very rare that it would happen, but yeah, it's like that guy who's like big and aggressive and scary and hyper violent, he's got to sleep sometime, right? And so eventually the other members of the group are going to be able to exact justice, right? So it's interesting, you didn't need things like police and courts and armies and judges and all that stuff in jails in order to actually keep things fairly level in these communities. So egalitarianism, was a very important component of these early human communities. Another interesting thing about how these communities operated, though, is that it's not like they didn't have any leaders. They did have leaders. Even though most people were very, very equal politically, sure, they had leaders. But the leaders were very different from the kinds of leaders that most of us are familiar with in our present day societies. So these small scale groups had leadership that was more based on prestige as opposed to coercive power. So I'll get into what I mean by that. So first of all, for an example, we can go back to the Kungsan, the Bushmen from the Kalahari Desert in Africa. So the Kung have leaders, and they tend to be elders. They can be either men or women. They're elders, and they tend to be greatly respected as wise people and also as shaman. They're seen to be connected to, spiritual knowledge. And they're an example of how leadership in these small scale egalitarian societies is based on prestige, not on coercion. So the idea is that in these societies, leaders are followed due to their characteristics because they're seen as good, wise people. They're patient. They tend to be even-tempered. They tend to be honest, wise. They tend to be peacemakers. They tend to be people that bring the group together, that work to resolve conflicts, right? And so That's where their power comes from, not their ability to force you to do anything. And so this is a picture of an elder, of a leader in one of the Kung San tribes. So this is a sweet old lady. She's not going to put you in a chokehold or something if you're acting up and force you to do anything. She can't. And that's not how it works. She is a leader because of her presence and the respect that the other people in the group have for her, because of her characteristics, because she's wise, she's patient, she listens, she brings people together, right? Helps the group make decisions. This is what prestige-based leadership is all about. And so these people are very seldom the strongest in the group. They are much more likely the wisest and the most socially competent people in the group. Almost never the most aggressive, right? And I just have in that little parentheses there, I have this thing about team sports. And if you think about prestige-based leadership, folks, anyone who's played team sports, I bet you've experienced this same phenomenon, right? So I'll just give you a brief example from my experience when I was younger. When I was in high school and grade school and high school, I played lacrosse. And so lacrosse is a game that, it's a pretty rough game. It's a fairly violent game. It's a contact sport, very aggressive, like very competitive, right? You got all these guys on the team that, and it's important to be tough, and it's important to, be aggressive and stuff like that. You're trying to win and everything. So think about that kind of environment, right? And yet, even in that kind of environment, who were the leaders of the team? Well, they weren't the most hyper-aggressive people. And there were some hyper-aggressive people on the team. Like there was that one guy who wanted to pick a fight with everybody and anyone, right? And he was largely seen as kind of annoying, but the team kind of tolerated it because it helps to have a couple of those guys on your side for the other team, right? You want to have one or two goons, but they weren't the leaders because they didn't have the respect of everyone on the team. The leaders tended to be the players who were, first of all, really good players. So they were skilled. So you respected them because of their skill. They were going to help you win. But the leaders were also the ones that helped the team come together, that helped people become better players, right? So sometimes it meant the leader barking at you if you weren't doing things right. Other times it meant the leader saying, right on, well done, right? So the leader had more social skills. They were respected by the group. They led through prestige, right? So that's sort of an example. And I think anyone who's played team sports, you can kind of relate to that, right? Who ends up being the leaders? It's not the ones who can force people to do things. It's not the most violent or aggressive people. It's the ones that people respect the most. And that's how leadership was in these small scale societies. So what's interesting about prestige-based leaders is, like I said, they can't force people to go along with them. They lead by example. And the group trusts them to have the group's best interests at heart. So think about it. If you're a small scale society, especially if you're living directly off the land, like things can be pretty intense at times. If the climate changes suddenly, right? If illness breaks out, there are existential threats, life and death situations all over the place. You need to make good decisions in a group like that. You can't afford to have someone who's a leader who's a total idiot, who doesn't know what they're doing. You'll literally die. Your group will not survive. And so again, the leaders had to be people where you trust, like, this guy or this woman knows what's going on. They know what is wise and what is smart. And that's how they become leaders, right? But what you see in these societies too is that the leader doesn't just sort of be like, okay, this is what we're going to do. Okay, everyone, it's kind of not how it works. They tend to make decisions by consensus. And that means consensus means the whole group gets together and they all kind of collectively decide what they're going to do. What the leader does, though, is first of all, they facilitate that dialogue, right? So in these societies, the leader is the one who's like, okay, let's call a meeting, let's get everyone together. Let's hear what everyone thinks. The leader facilitates this, right? And so they facilitate the consensus. However, it's not like they don't have their voice heard too. They do. And it's also given a lot of weight because, again, they're respected, but they're not dominating. They're not telling people what to do. There's another example from the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations. Of the Six Nations, one of the nations are known as the Onondaga, which I believe translates as people of the hills. And the Onondaga have this teaching that chiefs in the Six Nations Confederacy, so the chief, we think of the chief as like, oh, they're the single ruler, right? And they sit on top and they tell everyone what to do. But the Onondaga say, no, that's not how it is. They say the chief is at the base of the pyramid and everyone else stands on top of the chief's shoulder. They say that's what the chief needs to be like. They need to be strong enough to carry the whole group, not to have a big ego and want to sit on the top of the group, right? And in the Haudenosaunee tradition, chiefs are actually chosen by the women of the tribe. It's very interesting, right? So the clan mothers, the elder women who are very respected in the Haudenosaunee society, they choose the chief, and they choose by looking carefully. And the chief is a man, but a man chosen by the elder women. It's a very interesting system, right? And the clan mothers look for that person who has the strength of character, the respect, and the wisdom to lead, right? And they're the ones that are chosen to be leaders, to be the base of the pyramid that the whole society rests on. So again, very, very different. Like, imagine how different that form of leadership is from a lot of the modern day politics that we see. Like, imagine someone like Donald Trump, right? When he was in power in the United States, you could not get a more different form of leadership, right? I mean, you have in Trump a pure narcissist, someone who just, it's all about him all the time, right? And in the Onondaga, they're talking about the exact opposite. The chief is the person at the base, holding up the community, serving the entire community, right? Very, very different. So the leadership style in these communities is fascinating. And also, we can see how that would make for a very successful social model, right? If you're a small scale group trying to survive in a really harsh environment, and you have this kind of social structure and this kind of leadership, it's very powerful. It's going to help you survive. Another thing that really helped these groups survive, though, too, is how they viewed distributing resources among the group. So another anthropologist, this guy's name is Paul Radden, and he studied numerous hunter-gatherer groups from all over the world. And he realized that they had a common characteristic, and this was what he called the irreducible minimum. Irreducible means you can't reduce it any further. And minimum means it's like, the bare minimum, right? Irreducible minimum. And what he said is that in all of these groups, in every single one of these groups, there's the sense that every single member of the group is entitled to a minimum of food, shelter, clothing, participation in the community. Every single member is entitled to this. And you can't reduce that below. So in that group, unless someone does something really, really messed up. So say maybe, and this would have happened occasionally, say maybe someone is, extremely jealous or whatnot, and they murder someone else in the group. Well, in that case, yeah, you might get thrown out of the group. You might get exiled, okay? And that would be an example of getting pushed outside of the irreducible minimum. But you'd have to do something really, really incredible. Even if you were lazy or kind of a jerk and kind of no one liked you, still you would be entitled to food, clothing, shelter, protection. You'd still get to have your voice heard in the decision-making circles, right? Like, these communities took that seriously. Everybody had rights. Everybody had basic human rights. Because of this, there was simply no such thing as poverty, literally no such thing. And this is something that we really have to wrap our heads around. How completely different that is from our modern day societies. In our modern day societies, folks, if you walk downtown Hamilton, downtown Toronto, any big city, you see tons of people that we have pushed outside of the bounds of moral community. We have said, you're not entitled to the irreducible minimum. You're not entitled to a home and to, enough money to sustain yourself, to participation in society. We just say, no, you fend for yourself, right? You live on the street, you do whatever. It's completely different from how small scale societies operate. No individual is outside of the boundaries of moral community. Like I said, unless you do something really, really egregious. And then the worst punishment was exile, was basically like, oh, you're no longer part of the community. Like, you go fend for yourself if you do something horrible, right? So what's interesting about these communities is they provided total equality of opportunity. So everyone could participate as fully as they wanted to, right? Could hunt, could gather, could help make decisions, could, get involved in the spiritual life of the community, could produce arts, or could participate in ceremonies and rituals. Like, everyone was given opportunity. And they also ensured a lot of equality of outcome too, which means that at the end of the day, an example is in societies that rely on hunting for a large part of their food, almost as a rule, there was a culture in place where the hunter, as soon as they came back with their kill, everybody got some of that kill, right? It didn't matter if someone didn't participate. It didn't matter if someone was too old to hunt, too young to hunt, just unlucky. Someone sucks, they're a bad shot with a bow and arrow, doesn't matter. They're going to eat too. Someone makes a kill, everyone eats. That's just how those societies function, right? And so for that reason, you didn't have to ensure that everyone was equally good at everything. You don't even need to care about that. It just means that the people who are really good at stuff, they're going to end up helping the rest of the people. That's just what's going to happen. But what's kind of cool is, like I said, it doesn't mean then that the person who's really good isn't allowed to be excellent. You can be as excellent as you want. The group's going to be right on. See, maybe you're a total dead shot hunter and you're like an amazing, shot with a bow and arrow or with a spear or something. You're going to feed your whole group. They're going to love you for it. You're going to get all this prestige. You're going to be well respected, right? And yet still, because of the culture, you're not just going to be like, well, I'm going to keep all the food to myself because you folks suck and you can't shoot a bow to save your life or whatnot. Like, that's totally alien to these cultures, totally alien way of thinking, right? And so at the end of the day, everyone's able to do their own thing, and yet the group is sustained. No one is left out in the cold. So, but again, you can still strive for excellence. You still, gain prestige if you're really good at something, right? So it's really kind of a cool system that they ended up creating. So, these societies were politically equal. They were free, though. People could kind of do their own thing, and yet everyone was looked after. There's no poverty. There's nothing like that. There's no homelessness. Those things don't exist. But these communities also were incredibly sustainable. So they also lived well within their ecosystems. So an example of this is like this picture I have on the slide. This is a picture of a Balinese farming village. So, a little farming community in Bali, where, the main crop is rice, but they also grow other fruits and vegetables. They also raise some animals. The animals are used to do the farm work. And the whole village creates this sustainable closed loop ecosystem. And so an important point about the life system, this thing I've been talking about as the lecture's gone on, cooperation, egalitarianism, prestige-based leadership, the irreducible minimum, all of these aspects of the life system enable us to live sustainably within our ecosystems. And that's very, very important, because at the end of the day, folks, that's why they helped us survive. Living like this means we're able to survive in difficult environments. Democratic political processes mean that we get direct feedback from the ecosystems, right? So say maybe, the hunters go out one day and they're like, oh, there's tons of game animals and we're going to kill a few extra, even though we don't really need to, and then they bring them back to the group, and the wise elder is going to be like, whoa, why are we taking more than we need here? What if there's lean times a month away or 2 months away or whatnot? There'll be a big discussion about it. People will be like, oh yeah, you're right. Okay. We were being disrespectful. We took too much, that sort of thing. And they would regulate them. Right. And so when a group is able to make decisions that way, they're able to respond to changing environments very, very quickly and very easily. And this makes them very flexible. And also, because of the idea of interbeing, people literally thought that the world around them, the natural world, was part of their family. And so you didn't go around destroying the natural world. You didn't go around polluting the water and chopping down all the forests, destroying your agricultural land, wiping out all your game animals. You just didn't do that. It would seem like you're killing your family members, right? So that understanding also led to these societies being more sustainable. And then another point too, which I know I made earlier on when talking about the law of 7 generations, is that cooperative communities, these kinds of small scale egalitarian societies, they put the good of the whole group ahead of any one individual. Right? So any one person's desire for profit or adulation or control or whatever was not allowed to become greater than the sustainability of the whole group and the whole society, right? And this is very similar to the Haudenosaunee law of 7 generations, right? Are you thinking in the future? Are you thinking about the long-term survival of your community? This is the mentality that these small-scale societies have. And again, you've got transparent, accountable, community-focused leadership, which means your decisions actually benefit the group. You don't have corrupt politicians taking bribes from different interest groups, making decisions behind closed doors, and then lying to people about why they made the decision. You've got none of that in these societies. I mean, you're literally in the same room with the politicians making the decision at the same time. And the politicians have no real power except what you give them because you respect them, right? So, I mean, so many things that bedevil our current political system, you just simply don't have. And the end result, when you add all these things together, are communities that have been able to live for thousands of years in the same ecosystems, right? That is incredibly different from how industrial capitalist society operates. In the space of just a couple hundred years, we've come close to crashing the entire biosphere. We're not living within our limits, as we saw when we looked at the lecture on overshoot. However, these communities were able to live for thousands of years in the same ecosystem. So clearly, folks, there are important things we can learn from these early communities. So important insights. And yet it's also true that we know we don't live in farming villages, little farming villages anymore. We're not hunter-gatherers anymore, right? And so we need to try and think about how can these insights be brought into much more complex societies like ours. Well, we do live in highly complex state level societies, so very, very different from the hunter-gatherers. The question is then, can we translate these insights into more complex societies? Well, there's some interesting historical evidence that we can. So even if you look back at the very earliest complex human societies, so by this we're talking about the earliest state level civilizations. Well, in ancient Sumeria, the first city-states, which as far as we know, were literally the first state level civilizations on the planet, they were actually highly democratic. It's come to light through archaeological evidence that in these early city-states, the entire adult population formed a general assembly. They would get together to make decisions. They would elect their leaders, whom they called the Ensi. So that's incredible. Right from the very beginning of complex state-level societies, we see democracy right off the bat. Of course, we have the example, which we've talked about previously, of ancient Athens, right? So again, we're talking like over 2,300 years ago. A highly complex system of egalitarian decision-making was created in ancient Athens, in which the demos, the adult members of the community, all participated in decision-making. And as we talked about in previous lectures, demokratia literally means rule of the demos being all the adults, all of the people in the society. So clearly, it is possible, right? Right from the get-go, complex civilizations have been very democratic. So with ancient Athens, we need to mention a few caveats, right? First of all, it'd be wrong to say ancient Athens is a model for our present-day societies. It had some serious issues, right? It had a slave-based economy. Women weren't able to participate in the political system. And also it was a warrior society. It was an expansionist empire, right? So there's a lot of things that we could say, yeah, okay, ancient Athens wasn't so good about. However, for the people who could participate in the society, it was a very complex, but also very functional system of politics and law that was highly democratic, highly egalitarian, much more democratic than our society today, right? And in fact, the ancient Greeks, the ones like basically, free men, right, at a certain point, were the ones who were able to participate in the democracy. They seemed like absolutely paranoid about anyone gaining power or being able to dominate the rest. So they were super, super hardcore about making sure that everything was elected, everything was democratic. There was, no conflict of interest, anything like that. It was very, very democratic. And we have to remember that the reason why democracy began in Athens is it was a revolution against kings. So before democracy in Athens, ancient Greek city-states were ruled by kings and queens, right? And they were totally undemocratic. But the people didn't want that. The people wanted a say in how the government ran. They wanted a say in how their lives were organized. So they overthrew the kings and the tyrants and created democracy. And when ancient Athens became democratic, it ushered in an over 100-year cultural golden age in the city, where there was unprecedented advances in science, philosophy, and the arts. So what was clear about democracy too is it created this huge upsurge in creativity and inventiveness in all of these amazing cultural achievements. So, democracy is pretty powerful that way as well. It unleashes the creative potential of people and of societies. So to leave off, folks, in this one lecture, I mean, I talk about later on in the book, Radical Transformation, I talk about what it might look like in the modern era if we lived in accordance with the life system, right? So remember, the life system means that, we're living cooperatively based on our intelligence, and we're living with this idea of empathy and interbeing. Well, what would a society look like? Well, I put forward this idea, this possible society, and I call it democratic eco-socialism. So there's a whole bunch of things going on there. It'd be a democratic government. So again, a free, open government where we elect, the people who are going to make decisions, where we all participate in decision making. It would have a socialist economy, and what that basically means is an economy that would look after everyone. So everyone would have the irreducible minimum, but would still be free to, start a business, make money, whatever they wanted to do, right? But at the end of the day, everyone would get looked after. It would be a society based on human and citizenship rights, so no discrimination. Everyone's able to participate in the society. It would be organized on the idea of biosphere consciousness, so sustainability would be an important component. We wouldn't be destroying the water, the air, the agricultural land, all that sort of stuff. Instead, we'd be living sustainably. And so this is possible, I just think, which is kind of interesting. It's a little bit beyond this course to get into great detail in terms of what this kind of society could look like. But there are elements of it all over the place. And in fact, in the last 2 lectures in the course, we're going to look at some really interesting examples in different parts of the world of ways of living that are deeply democratic, but also nurturing of human and non-human life, that are very, very sustainable. There's a lot that is possible. So without further ado, folks, let's leave off there. What we've established, I hope, in this lecture is that early human communities evolved to be highly sustainable. They did it based on cooperation, on interbeing, on our intelligence. We created these incredible communities where we were able to express the fullness of our nature in harmony with the natural world. And because of that, we were able to survive into the present day. There are important lessons we can learn from these small-scale societies. In the next lecture, we're going to address the mystery of what the heck happened. How did we move from these very sustainable, egalitarian, harmonious societies to the kinds of societies that we experience today? So that will be the lecture that we will do this coming Friday. So we'll see you soon.